Hello and welcome to another episode of V's Perspective. In this episode, we'll talk about where is the Indo-Pacific strategy of Donald Trump heading. Does he have one? Does America have a Indo-Pacific policy under Donald Trump, or is it as the Chinese would love to describe it, a foam on the sea which would wither away? Now, the most recent example, of course, is the Shangri-La dialogue, which ended um, just last week in Singapore with some clear um, outlines of a Indo-Pacific policy, or at least the thought outlines of the United States, where the Indo-Pacific policy is and what is the thinking within the Trump administration in terms of where they want to go with the Indo-Pacific policy. Clearly, you have on one side the idea that nations, partners, allies, and friends of the United States should step up in the region. That's a clear outline from Washington, D.C., and that's a clear message that came out of Pete Hegseth's statement in the dialogue. Um, Clearly, there are two or three strands that came out visibly strongly than in the past. One is, of course, in relation to how the United States looks at Taiwan. There were great degree of ambiguity as to what the United States position would be under Donald Trump, which is extremely transactional when it comes to deals with when it comes to negotiations and relationships with countries. What would that administration do in the case of a contingency, in the case of a Taiwan contingency? And I think you saw some clear outlines in terms of Pete Hegseth's commitment, or his outline of the commitment of the United States to its Taiwan's defense. Would that hold in the long run is a question that anybody uh, could surmise and find themselves to be hitting a wall, because clearly it's a hypothetical position where how much would the United States and how would the United States respond to China's taking of Taiwan is a question that remains very, very unclear at this point, because of the contingencies that are outside the purview of most analysts. But the things on the ground, given the highlight, the underpinning, the stress by the United States on the idea that Chinese belligerence in the region, especially against Taiwan, is growing, is reflective of the recognition that Washington has taken note of what is happening and is perhaps preparing, or is ready to prepare towards a towards a finality of some sorts in terms of their response. Um, One of the strongest, and what we heard at the Shangri-La dialogue, it was one of the strongest defenses of Taiwan, of a potential defenses of Taiwan from the United States, that went much beyond the six assurances and the ideas in the paper in terms of how the United States wants to defend Taiwan. So that's one. The second is that there is a recognition and there is a push from the United States that's coming our way, which is the Indo-Pacific countries' way, where the expectation from DC is going to grow in terms of how they want and what they want from countries in this part of the region. One idea is, of course, that the push that Washington currently is employing against the transatlantic countries is going to settle at some point in time, and then that push is going to come to the Indo-Pacific, which is when countries like Japan, countries like India, countries like Australia are going to be asked to do more. How remains, of course, each country's own discretion in terms of where they want to take this. So I think to that extent, um, there there has been a clear enunciation of how Washington looks at the Indo-Pacific. It calls the Trump administration is no different than the past administrations in calling the United States a resident power of the Indo-Pacific. Of There's no difference in terms of how they look at China in terms of a strategic threat and a pacing challenge of this century or of this decade, and of course the necessity to defend its critical allies in the region, um, against China. So those three principles, I think, stand very strongly still. Where has the metric changed? I think the metrics have changed in terms of how the United States views its allies and partners in the region to be in a capacity to respond to the Chinese challenge. There is a recognition in DC that this cannot be done alone, and they need partners to be able to steer this Indo-Pacific strategy, and which is why some of these countries will have to step up. So that was a clear enunciation. The second important message that came out of Shangri-La dialogue and Pete Hegseth's statement is the fact that there's going to be increasing pressure, and the idea that extended deterrence was something that was taken for granted by the allies and partners of Washington, D.C., of the United States in this part of the region no longer stands true. Those will come with certain costs, and how those costs are going to play out is something that countries will have to decide themselves based on the demands from Washington, D.C. So that's second. The third aspect that brings me also to what Macron, the French president, said at the Shangri-La dialogue in his keynote, which is that they do want to look at the Indo-Pacific in a new way. And in the next few weeks, there's going to be an Indo-Pacific strategy that the European Union wants to look at. Now, two things come out of this. One is Europe's own repositioning vis-a-vis the United States and the Indo-Pacific, vis-a-vis the United States because of the reordering of the transatlantic alliance, and what that means for the role of Europe in the world. The second is that the European continent and EU finds an opportunity in the idea that so long as there is increasing pressure on Washington's allies in this region, then of course there's an opportunity for European Union to step in and say, hey, we are there, can we partner on certain things and have a relook at this Indo-Pacific strategy, because many countries in this region don't want a war. Most countries in this region don't want a conflict. Therefore, European Union senses an opportunity that a new Indo-Pacific strategy could really create that space for countries that want to hedge and not necessarily get into a quid pro quo with Washington, D.C. in terms of their commitments to the Indo-Pacific region, to be able to shift the gears and shift camps a little bit, or straddle the camps between Brussels and Washington, D.C. How that, these are complications that are going to play out in the next few years. We'll have to wait and see how the European Union what the European Union comes up with in terms of their Indo-Pacific strategy, and what is the response of Washington, D.C. Clearly, if Washington, D.C. under Trump looks at the Indo-Pacific as a critical region where it wants commitments, where it wants sustained commitments, then I think it will not be happy for European Union to step in with a new Indo-Pacific strategy of their own, where hedging can come in a more pronounced way. So long as it doesn't come or doesn't encroach upon the United States' own objectives, I think it should be fine. But we'll have to wait and see in terms of how Trump himself looks at the Indo-Pacific strategy. A critical juncture in all this is, of course, the Quad Leaders Summit, potentially in September this year, but we'll have to wait and see what comes out of it. Let me stop here. Thank you.